The flight was not on any official manifests that Washington monitors. It was logged, as all flights are logged, in the federal aviation records that exist for the purpose of safety rather than the purpose of politics, and it sat in those records with the unremarkable patience of a document that knows it will eventually be read by someone who understands what it means, but has no obligation to announce itself before that reading occurs. The aircraft was a state-owned Cessna Citation, 9 seats, operated by the Executive Aviation Office of a Midwestern state government for the routine transport of elected officials to meetings that the elected officials' schedules describe in the flat administrative language of people who have learned that the description of a meeting and the meaning of a meeting are two different documents and only one of them needs to be filed publicly. The flight plan said Ottawa. The purpose field, which is optional in the filing framework and is completed with whatever level of specificity the filer chooses to provide, said government business. 2 words. Accurate in the way that true things can be accurate while communicating considerably less than the full truth. The aircraft landed at Ottawa MacDonald Cartier International Airport at 9:47 in the morning on a Wednesday. The governor of the state disembarked with 2 aides and a security detail of 3. No press. No advance team. No notification to the American Embassy in Ottawa, which would have been the standard protocol for a senior elected American official conducting anything that could be construed as diplomatic engagement on Canadian soil. No notification to the State Department. No notification to the White House. The cars that met them on the tarmac were Canadian government vehicles. The drive to the meeting took 14 minutes. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. The White House found out from a local newspaper. There is a phrase at the center of this story. It was not spoken in the 2 hours and 11 minutes of the meeting, or if it was spoken there, it was spoken in a room with no record and no witness beyond the people present, who have not described what was said in any public forum. The phrase emerged afterward, in the coverage that followed the local newspaper's account, in the particular way that phrases emerge when a situation has created a need for language that did not previously exist, and someone finds the words before anyone else does, and the words are correct enough that everyone who reads them recognizes that the finding has already happened, and the only thing left is to repeat it. The phrase will come. But first, the governor, and what the governor had understood that the governors who stayed home had not yet understood or had understood and were not yet prepared to act upon. The Midwestern state that the governor represented had a specific and quantifiable relationship with Canada that the trade confrontation had rendered visible in the way that a leak renders visible the pipe that has been failing for months behind the wall. The state exported $7 billion in goods to Canada annually, not to the world, to Canada. The single largest export destination for the state's agricultural output, its automotive components, its specialty chemicals, and the particular category of heavy manufacturing equipment that the state's industrial corridor had been producing since the post-war period when the bilateral trade relationship was built on the assumption that proximity and complementarity were sufficient foundations for permanence. The tariffs had introduced a third variable. Proximity remained. Complementarity remained. But the assumption of permanence had been replaced in the spreadsheets of the state's Department of Commerce and in the conversations of the manufacturers and farmers and logistics operators whose livelihoods were denominated in the bilateral relationship by the assumption of contingency. The contingency was costing the state an estimated $340 million per quarter in reduced export revenue, increased input costs, and the particular category of economic damage that does not appear immediately in any single line item, but accumulates in the decisions that businesses do not make. The expansion that is deferred, the contract that is not renewed, the equipment order that is placed on hold until someone in a position of authority demonstrates that the conditions will stabilize. The governor had been making phone calls for 6 weeks before the flight, not to Washington. Washington had received his calls on this subject with the courteous attentiveness that the executive branch extends to governors of states it needs in an election year, and the practical inattentiveness of an administration that has decided on a trade posture and does not find the economic concerns of Midwestern manufacturers a sufficient reason to revise it. The calls had produced meetings. The meetings had produced the specific category of output that meetings produce when the people in them are listening without the intention of acting. Summaries, follow-up commitments, assurances that the concerns were understood and would be considered in the ongoing policy review. The policy review had been ongoing for 7 months. The concerns had been considered in the sense that they had been received and filed. They had not been considered in the sense that they had changed anything. The governor had, by the 6th week, arrived at a conclusion that he described to his chief of staff in a conversation that the chief of staff later recounted to a journalist in terms sufficiently general to be attributable but sufficiently specific to be useful. The conclusion was this: the person who could actually help was not in Washington. The person who could actually help was in Ottawa. And the protocol that required him to notify Washington before speaking to Ottawa was a protocol designed for conditions that no longer fully described the situation his state was in. He called Ottawa himself, not through the standard diplomatic channel that routes gubernatorial requests for foreign engagement through the State Department's Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, which channel would have generated a notification to the White House before the call was returned. He called through a trade relationship that existed at the sub-federal level, a bilateral working group between his state's Department of Commerce and its Canadian provincial counterpart that had been operating for 11 years on the prosaic business of cross-border regulatory alignment, and that had, among its accumulated institutional assets, a direct line to the office of the federal minister responsible for trade, which line existed because the working group's federal liaison function required it and which had never previously been used for anything more consequential than scheduling a conference call about customs documentation. The minister's office returned the call within 4 hours. The conversation that followed was brief and practical. The governor said he would like to meet with Prime Minister Carney directly. The minister's office said it would convey the request. The request was conveyed. The response came back within 48 hours. The Prime Minister would meet. Wednesday. 2 hours. Ottawa. The governor booked the Cessna citation. Ellen has worked in the Ottawa Press Gallery for 19 years. She is 48 years old. She lives in a second-floor apartment in the Centertown neighborhood, 7 minutes by bicycle from the Parliament buildings, a commute she makes every morning, regardless of weather, in the particular way that people who have chosen a city make their peace with what that city requires of them seasonally. She has covered 4 prime ministers, 2 elections, 3 confidence votes, and the specific category of story that does not announce itself but reveals itself to the person who is paying attention to the right things at the right moment. She had been paying attention to the tarmac. Not because she had been told to pay attention to the tarmac, but because she had noticed 3 weeks earlier that the pattern of arrivals at Ottawa McDonald Cartier had changed in a way that the aviation records, which she checked as a matter of professional habit, made visible to anyone who was looking. State-owned American aircraft. Single-day visits. No embassy notification logged in the standard diplomatic arrival records that the Foreign Affairs Department publishes with a 24-hour delay. She had been keeping a list. On Wednesday morning, she drove to the airport. She waited. She saw the Cessna citation land. She saw the governor disembark. She took photographs. She identified the Canadian government vehicles. She drove back to her office and began writing. The story was filed at 2:14 in the afternoon. It was published at 3:47. By 5:30, it had been read by someone in the White House press office who sent it to someone else with a 3-word message. Is this real? The someone else confirmed that it was. The White House press office sent a query to the State Department. The State Department sent a query to the embassy in Ottawa. The embassy in Ottawa confirmed the visit through the same aviation records that Ellen had been checking for 3 weeks. The visit had lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. It was over. The governor was already in the air. The 2 hours and 11 minutes in the meeting room produced no communique, no joint statement, no photograph released to the press, no readout from either government's communications office describing the topics discussed or the outcomes reached. What it produced, in the weeks that followed, was visible not in any document, but in a pattern of decisions. Procurement redirections, supply chain adjustments, bilateral working group activations at the provincial and state level. That people who track cross-border trade flows recognized as the downstream evidence of an upstream conversation that had established something concrete enough to act upon. The governor returned to his state and convened within 10 days of the Ottawa meeting a series of roundtables with the agricultural exporters and automotive manufacturers and logistics operators whose businesses were most directly affected by the trade confrontation. The roundtables were described in the governor's office press releases as stakeholder engagement sessions on trade diversification strategy. The participants who attended them described them differently, in private, to the journalists who called them afterward. They described a governor who had come back from Ottawa with specific information about what Canada was and was not prepared to offer at the bilateral level, and with a framework for how state-level relationships could be structured to provide a degree of stability that the federal-level confrontation was not providing and was not, in the governor's assessment, likely to provide in the near term. 3 of the state's largest agricultural exporters announced within 6 weeks of the roundtables that they had entered into direct supply agreements with Canadian provincial purchasing authorities. The agreements were not contingent on federal trade policy resolution. They were structured in the language of the contracts to operate within the existing legal framework regardless of tariff conditions, with pricing mechanisms that absorbed a portion of the tariff cost in exchange for the supply security that a direct provincial relationship provided. The agreements were, in their legal structure, unremarkable. In their political structure, they were the formalization of a conclusion that 31,000 engineers and 6 state water authorities and 19 cybersecurity procurement committees had already reached by different routes, that the bilateral relationship could be maintained at a functional level through subfederal and non-federal channels that did not require the federal confrontation to resolve before the practical work could continue. The White House response to the governor's visit moved through the now familiar sequence. The first phase was procedural. Questions raised through appropriate channels about the protocol implications of a senior elected official conducting what appeared to be independent diplomatic engagement without federal coordination, framed in the language of alliance management and the importance of speaking with one voice in bilateral relationships. The governor's office responded that the visit had been a trade and economic development meeting consistent with the governor's long-standing engagement with Canada on behalf of the state's export economy, and that the governor's office had not been aware of any federal prohibition on such engagement, which was accurate in the sense that no such prohibition exists in statute and the protocol requirement for notification is a convention rather than a legal obligation. The second phase was political. Pressure applied through the party channels and the appropriations relationships that the federal government maintains with state governments as instruments of alignment, the practical leverage that Washington exercises over state capitals through the architecture of federal funding. The governor absorbed the pressure without revising his account of the visit or expressing regret for the protocol departure, which is the response of someone who has calculated that the political cost of the pressure is lower than the political cost of the economic conditions that had motivated the flight in the first place. The third phase was the one that mattered most and was discussed least in the public coverage. It was the phone calls that the governor received in the 2 weeks following the story's publication from 11 other governors. Not all from the same party, not all from states with the same economic profile, but all from states that had a significant trade relationship with Canada and had been watching Washington's management of the bilateral confrontation with the growing concern of elected officials whose constituents experience economic conditions as facts rather than as policy positions. All 11 calls asked, in various formulations, the same question. The question was, how did you set up the meeting? Henry Stimson, who served as Secretary of War during the Second World War and whose understanding of the relationship between federal authority and state initiative was shaped by the specific conditions of a conflict that required both, observed in his memoir that the most consequential acts of government are not always the ones that originate at the highest level of authority. They are sometimes the ones that originate at the level closest to the consequence, the level at which the abstract becomes concrete, the policy becomes a price, and the elected official's responsibility to the people who elected them becomes more immediate than the responsibility to the protocol that a distant administration has chosen to enforce. Stimson was describing a different era and a different set of conditions. The observation had not become less true. What the governor had done in booking a 9-seat Cessna Citation and landing at Ottawa MacDonald Cartier without telling Washington was exercise the judgment of someone for whom the consequence was not abstract, for whom the $340 million per quarter was not a line in a briefing document, but a fact visible in the faces of the farmers and manufacturers and logistics operators who had been in his office for 6 weeks, describing what the confrontation was doing to the businesses that his state had spent 60 years building. The judgment was simple. The protocol could be explained. The $340 million per quarter could not be. The phrase that emerged from the coverage was not spoken by the governor and not spoken by Carney and not spoken by anyone in either government's official communications. It was spoken by a farmer in the governor's state in one of the trade roundtable sessions in response to a question from a journalist who had been allowed to observe part of the session. The journalist asked the farmer what the governor's Ottawa meeting meant for his operation. The farmer thought about the question for a moment. Then he said, "It means somebody finally went to the right meeting." Benign words. Not a diplomatic formulation, not a policy statement. The words of a person for whom the abstract had long since become concrete and who had been waiting, without a vocabulary for what he was waiting for someone in a position of authority to make a decision that the position of authority made possible. Somebody finally went to the right meeting. It traveled through the agricultural press and the state government policy community and the diplomatic analysis community in the way that true things travel when they name something precisely and the naming arrives before anyone has found a better way to say it. There is something that the history of federal systems teaches, across the centuries during which nations built on the premise of divided sovereignty have navigated the tension between the unity that foreign policy requires and the diversity that democratic governance produces. It teaches that the division of sovereignty is not a flaw in the architecture. It is the architecture. It exists because the people who designed it understood that the concentration of all authority in a single point of decision is not strength. It is fragility. The governor who flew to Ottawa without telling Washington did not violate the architecture. He used it. He used the portion of sovereignty that belongs to the states, the portion that was reserved in the design of the system, precisely for the moments when the federal exercise of authority produces consequences that the states must manage but did not choose and cannot alter at the federal level. Trump tried to make the Ottawa meeting a breach of protocol serious enough to overshadow what the meeting was about. The story had already been published. He tried to use the procedural critique to reframe the governor's judgment as disloyalty. 11 governors had already called to ask how to book the same flight. He tried to make the Cessna Citation landing at Ottawa McDonald Cartier feel like an aberration. The aviation records showed it was the fourth such landing in 6 weeks, and the list Ellen was keeping had not stopped growing. Somebody finally went to the right meeting, and the right meeting, it turned out, was not the one in Washington that had been producing summaries and follow-up commitments and assurances that the concerns were understood. It was the one in Ottawa that lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes and produced no communique and no photograph and no readout, only a governor who came home with something concrete enough to act upon, and acted and watched 11 colleagues call to ask how he had done it, and told them because the protocol he had departed from was a convention, and conventions, when they stop serving the people they were designed to serve, are revised not by the people who wrote them, but by the people who can no longer afford to follow them. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.